Hi, thanks everyone for coming. It's so nice to see everyone here. In July of 2008, the New York Times ran a story on the American Medical Association. It was a little article. The AMA had apologized publicly for its, quote, past history of racial inequality toward African American physicians and their participation in the American Medical Association. In the apology, the AMA was referring chiefly to black physicians and aspiring medical students who sought admission to medical schools and residency programs in the 20th century and were turned away on the basis of their race. In applying to white medical schools, these black men and women sought approval and sanction from white medical authorities of their day. And to understand something about the conditions that gave rise to African Americans wanting to learn medicine in the early 20th century and being barred from medical education for much of the 20th century, and then apologized to in the 21st century, because I'm a historian, we have to go back to the 19th century. And I was thinking, standing here, it's kind of moving for me to deliver this in a hall where so many Williams pre-medical students have sat for so many years. And think about the kind of structures that kept certain people out and let certain people in. So it's fitting to be with the periodic table of elements there. Don't ask any questions about that. Around the time of the Civil War, the medical profession was tightening up, or trying to tighten up around the edges, disallowing homeopaths and beginning to consider regulating medical education. This tightening up project encompassed not only a concern for patients' care, which was certainly there, but also a new investment in the image of a professional, orderly, respectable doctor. Innovations in surgery and efficiency during the Civil War contributed to this image, and so over the sort of mid-19th century, even the spaces where doctors worked were hopefully or ideally clean, orderly, and efficient. For black doctors, though, another popular perception competed against the respectable professional man of medicine in the American cultural imagination, and that was that of a quack doctor or a conjurer. Right here is a comic picture of such a person, a medicine man, maybe rather than a man of medicine. So I don't know how much you can see here. This says Dr. Post-Mortem on his bag, and he has a saw and an idiotic expression and a kind of shriveled up body. So this is actually like a sheet music cover from a little later than the Civil War. But that's sort of what was a popular image of what a black doctor might look like and be like. No one you would really want to have look after you. And today, I'd like to talk about John Donaldson of Austin, Texas. And he is a black doctor who I think sort of falls in between those two images. A professional, orderly, kind of well-educated white doctor, and an ill-trained and dangerous quack like our friend here. His life and his idea of himself as a doctor and other people's reactions to his medical practice show how thinking of doctors as either quacks or conjurers or professional, well-trained doctors robs us of an interesting story and some insights into the history of African Americans and healers in this country. Donaldson's story shows how race shaped black people's ability to practice medicine, even beyond the problem of not being allowed to attend medical school. As you'll see, John Donaldson does not at all fit the profile of a worthy, aspiring, professional African-American medical student or doctor that the AMA was apologizing to. John Donaldson appears only fleetingly in history, and rather than longing for professional training in medicine, he actually rejected standard training and white-controlled medical authority. In fact, when Helga asked me for a title for this talk, I knew I wanted to share the story with you of John Donaldson, and his adult life saw enslavement, the Civil War, and emancipation in both Texas and Alabama. But I hesitated about my title, He's Got No License Nor No Deplomer. First, I was afraid people might not understand the words because they're that's a quote from one of his letters. But mostly, I worried that it might give the impression of Donaldson as apologetic or ashamed about his lack of formal education and his lack of formal credentials as a medical doctor. And I hope to show you today that's far from the truth of the personality of this man. I want to talk about his life, his medical practice, and what they show us actually about the first years of freedom in the South. Also, since I'm among friends, I want to share with you some of the lessons that I'm still learning from studying John Donaldson, whose personality stands so at odds with notions of respectability and professionalism. And his story continues to surprise me and has really made me challenge my own analyses and my intellectual hunches, which you'll see were all wrong as I go through his story. The events I want to talk to you about today begin with letters from Donaldson himself to the National Office of the Bureau for Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, which I'll just refer to as the Freedmen's Bureau, or simply the Bureau. Set up just after the Civil War under military auspices, the Bureau's task was to tend to the needs of white refugees and newly freed African Americans. The former Confederacy was split into districts, each with its own staff, and the national office was in Washington, D.C. And much of the Bureau's work concerned brokering labor contracts between white landowners and African American agricultural laborers. Because Donaldson wrote to the national office in Washington, D.C., rather than his local office in Texas, that's where I found his correspondence in Washington, which becomes important. So the first letter from Donaldson was dated in June of 1866, and it was addressed to Howard, Commissioner Howard of the Freedmen's Bureau. And Donaldson sought redress against a whole batch of parties in Austin, but namely various African-American freed people whom he claimed had not paid him for medical services he provided. And he was also angry, as you'll see, at local Bureau agents who'd refused to help him in collecting these debts. He believed that part of the role of the Freedmen's Bureau was to enforce the law and the payment of debts that he believed were owed to him. In his letter, Donaldson claimed that long before emancipation, he was accustomed to providing medical care to slaves for a fee. And from all that I can deduce, Donaldson was also a slave. And how he learned to read and write, I do not know. The arrival of emancipation brought with it the Freedmen Bureau oversight into some areas of African American life that had previously been either supervised by white owners or in many cases not supervised at all by white authority. And African American medical care was a realm that fell sort of in between these two extremes. Masters had certainly been concerned about the health of their slaves. Indeed, ensuring that slaves remained healthy served a number of purposes. Healthy adult slaves labored productively and turned a profit for their owners, providing enough medical care and food and such to keep slaves healthy and able to reproduce made good financial sense for white slave owners in the South. But slave owners had other reasons as well for providing adequate care, even to enslaved children or slaves who were elderly or past their prime. Defenders of slavery often pointed to the care, particularly that elderly slaves received, as evidence of the humanity of slave owners. And they point to this ad nauseum. Many slave owners were very fond of documenting for themselves and posterity and Williams historians all the money and time and energy that they spent keeping slaves healthy. But actually, slaves' health was usually quite poor. The work that they did made them vulnerable to injuries and diseases of various kinds, and punishments like whipping and other things took a real physical toll on slaves' bodies. Housing and nutrition was also quite poor. But alongside this care that white people provided, another whole system of care existed within slave communities, beyond the care that white owners or overseers or white doctors who were employed to look after slaves could provide. Largely invisible and often misunderstood by owners, many African Americans did practice medicine. Overwhelmingly illiterate and far removed from any formal medical training, many slaves made medicines from local flora, and many combined these with psychological and emotional aspects of healing. Slaves tended one another through illness and injury, and many had sort of particular skills in areas like midwifery. John Donaldson's medical practice seems to have grown out of this tradition, this slave tradition. Donaldson, though literate and committed to telling his story, lacked the narrative restraint that was increasingly becoming part of the professional demeanor in the late 19th century. His opening words across the top of his letter are wrong written. That is what it says, and it is wrong written. It sort of shows, it's even before the salutation or the date or anything, maybe to warn the reader of unconventional spelling and grammar, which he certainly has. But on the other hand, wrong written may have been less a comment on errors than a confession of Donaldson's frustration with the ordeal of using the written word to express his emotion. And this is all about other things. But down here, you can see concerning the doctoring. Can you see that? Midway through his long letter, he wrote, I love this quote, "I can't give you the history. I can't write you the history. I give you a sketch." And his self-proclaimed difficulties with the written word had little effect on the articulate oral style of his letter that he used to recount the history of his past year. And the only way I could understand how he writes is just to read it aloud. That's the only way. And I have to confess, my first look at this letter, with his whole stream of consciousness way of telling what happened to him, really made me sympathetic with the grumpy bureaucrats in Washington who would receive this. So in this first letter, he complained about the disrespect that the local agent in Texas, Evans is his name, had shown him. And Evans, like a lot of commissioners in southern states, had employed a white doctor to treat freed people. Some local bureaus even set up dispensaries and hospitals to treat freedmen in the first years of freedom. Donaldson's letter recounts his anger at the arrival of a white doctor who competed with him for patients. He wrote, and this quotation gives you a nice sense of his voice, "Excuse a deranged man. I attend day and night. It got in the ears of the whites, and they said to the freedmen for spite, 'He's got no license, nor no diploma. Don't pay him. You'll make that off of him,'" unquote. And in defense of his own medical expertise, he offers testimony about his patients and the cures he had worked on them. According to Donaldson, Austin had experienced increased mortality since the Freedmen's Bureau forced him to discontinue his practice. His letter gave a death tally among Austin residents. He wrote, "See how many died since I quit. Albert Brown and wife, 2. George Rust, 3. William Risher, 4. Daniel Rust, 5. Mrs. Niley Johnson, 6. 3 infants make 9. Donaldson wrote that he had showed the captain my reports yesterday. His countenance fell, and his letter continued to document Agent Evans' response. He wrote, "I asked him to read. He refused to read." In Donaldson's view, having to show proof of cures was an imposition, but even after he had showed that proof, white authorities still refused to take him seriously. As a result of the Bureau's interference, Donaldson wrote, "In order to continue his medical work, I had to insure every case, no cure, no pay." So the end of the Civil War and freedom, emancipation, and the arrival of the Freedmen's Bureau were actually disastrous for Donaldson's medical doings. Practices like Donaldson's that employed paradigms of healing foreign to white doctors may well have flourished during slavery out of sight of white surveillance. Donaldson was affronted that freedom was accompanied by the arrival of a white doctor who effectively put him out of business. Furthermore, the white doctor operated under the auspices of the Freedmen's Bureau, and in a larger sense, under a wide umbrella of freedom and modern scientific medicine. The Bureau, a military organization and a fully formed bureaucracy, was all bound up with statistical tables and objective reports and military hierarchy, and it stood in stark contrast to Donaldson, whose letter is wrong written. Donaldson's letter does ramble on and on about his medical prowess, but he has real insight into how freedom changed this aspect of African American life. According to Donaldson, the Freedmen's Bureau was not content to allow, as slave masters had, the coexistence of his practice alongside more standard medicine practiced by white doctors. The arrival of the white doctor and the Bureau's role in discouraging black patients from paying Donaldson for medical services hindered his ability to charge and collect fees. Donaldson's complaints were manifold and fascinating, and here, later in the letter, I'll tell you, he has all these outbreaks of emotion and outrage at the memory of his treatment at the hands of other freedmen and also the local Bureau officials. And departing from the ideal of a citizen and a professional ruled by reason, Donaldson, he notes his own reactions and anger, calling himself, you might remember, a deranged man. Donaldson's harshest words are for Evans, whom he accused of overtly encouraging freedmen in their non-payment of bills. Evans did, in fact, discourage people from going to Donaldson and from paying him if they did. In his own letter, that came right after this one, to the Washington office, defending himself against Donaldson's claims, he stated, when he told Donaldson that, quote, his conjuring must be stopped, Donaldson became furious and desperate, so much I had to order him out of my office. Donaldson's conduct and the context of his complaint stood in stark contrast to developing codes of behavior, demeanor, and training for physicians, and he stood at odds with both modern notions of medicine and how medical men should conduct themselves. His medical authority rested on self-compiled evidence and a claim to an organic, natural, and implicit connection to the people and land of Central Texas. Setting himself apart from standard white medical science, he claimed an authenticity specific to the climate and to the original inhabitants of Texas. He wrote in his letter, I am not a mineral physician professionally. I can use it, but it is not good in this climate. I use rather herbs. My father had me learned under an Indian physician when young, and if any man say, I ever lost a case, he is vast mistaken. Rather than model himself after modern doctors who point to scientific and technical knowledge gained during the Civil War, Donaldson rejected new ideas of medical science. He embraced a medical past shaped by slave culture in a world where spiritual matters, personality, and flora all informed a healer's knowledge and combined to give medical power. His understanding connected the body to the larger environment and to the cosmos. And his vision of being a free doctor entailed using his own medicine and being paid for it by black people. Indeed, he explicitly rejected the medicine espoused by the Bureau. His claim that he could use mineral medicine if he liked, but found it wrong for the climate, revealed his understanding of how and why the body heals that was distinct from a conceptual framework that was gaining ascendancy after the Civil War. And his letter to Washington highlighted a key element of folk medicine, that the same substance differently prepared or consumed by a patient with different ailments could have opposite effects. In the letter, toward the end, he wrote, rather ominously, I thought, I will send you a piece of this herb to test whether it is poison or no, as sweet as honey or as bitter as gall. Learn what that means. Which is kind of a crazy thing to write to the Washington Freedmen's Bureau. And I think he actually did put a piece of something in that envelope, but of course I don't know that. So in the very first year of African American freedom, 1866, Donaldson found that his system of medical practice, which worked quite well when both he and his patients were enslaved, had different connotations and vulnerability to white governmental control after emancipation. In his letter to the Bureau, Donaldson complained that news of his treatments and hard work, attending day and night, had got into the ears of the whites in Austin, and they tried to steal his business. They told his patients because he did not have a medical diploma, he was not entitled to payment for services rendered. Now I should note at this point, when I encountered the documents relating to Donaldson, when I got to this point in the story, I thought I was done, and I gave myself a little pat on the back. And I was certain that Donaldson was clearly representative of an older, more authentic slave healing tradition, and that white racist Bureau agents were unwilling to allow Donaldson to charge money for his services, even though he no doubt brought emotional comfort and spiritual presence to the bedsides of sick people in his community. But the story doesn't stop there. And I remembered a professor I had in college who told me I needed to become an archive junkie. And even though I thought I had a nice little story about a black man supported by his community and undone by the Freedmen's Bureau and their preconceptions, I kept digging around. So sure enough, there was more correspondence that came along with his letter to Washington. Evans, the villain, Agent Evans, wrote to the Federal Bureau on a different occasion that the serpent, Dr. John Donaldson, is a non-compos mentis freedman. Furthermore, Donaldson is known as a conjurer, a believer in witches, hobgoblins, and ghosts. Well, that was so far so good. A white agent with no understanding of African American medical culture would call any kind of healing with a spiritual element conjuring. And he would describe any kind of spiritual or emotional connection with the dead as a belief in witches, hobgoblins, and ghosts, since that fell outside his kind of understanding of Christian doctrine. Evans described Donaldson's medical practice as purely deception on the freedmen, and that made him, quote, put a quietus on his operations here, in which act I am sustained by all the freedmen of this place. Porter, who also worked with Evans, had this comment about Donaldson's activities. His school of medicine is a cross of the botanical and African conjuring. The Bureau's attitude toward Donaldson is revealing. Donaldson's claim that the Bureau was hostile to his sort of medicine, which he called herb and Porter called a mix of botanical and African conjuring, is borne out. Bureau agents' writings decried Donaldson's belief in the supernatural and concluded that he was a conceited simpleton, practicing deception on the freedmen. Worse, his medical practice targeted those colored people who were inclined to be superstitious. Indeed, Evans wrote, the better class of freedmen sustained me in my course with him. To Evans and the other Bureau agents who supported him, Donaldson's offense was his conjuring. The concept of medicine, healing, and illness that he had was not proper, and a practice that would actually hold freed people back from self-improvement and from joining the better class of African Americans. And I really want to know who were these better class of freedmen who preferred white doctors, because that was sort of popping my argument balloon that I told you before. And the balloon popped when I found the next letter that came from the better class of freedmen. This is from the Texas Loyal League of Liberty that wrote in the autumn of 1866. This is their petition. And they wrote in support of Evans. A group of ex-slaves wrote that they were glad to find we have friends in Washington. And as to this conflict between Donaldson and Evans, they said, we will ensure you that it is not so, for we is as well acquainted with our good agent as John Donaldson. John Donaldson, we are well acquainted with him and do not wish to injure him, but it is not strange to us that you have such a report given from the hand of him, for he is a pest. He passes for a quack doctor, and we're sure that his complaint is only for himself. And this is interesting too, I think, because Donaldson can write, but none of these people who signed the petition can write. They all signed with their mark. And the person who actually wrote it out was a black woman, Mary Thomas. She was the only one in the Texas Loyal League who could write. So they wanted to embrace, these folks, the new modern medical practice. And their campaign was for new mineral medicine overseen and advocated by the Bureau and white doctors instead of this medical structure that Donaldson represented. So race was not a significant dividing line between Donaldson's supporters and detractors. And then I was actually wondering if he had any supporters at all. Even if he did cure and comfort people out of illness during slavery, it's not clear that all African Americans viewed that kind of medicine as something that they wanted to carry with them into freedom, even if it had been comforting and even resistant under the plantation regime. Donaldson probably was owed the $35 by various freed people, as he claimed. Indeed, even the agents who testified repeatedly to his mental instability do concede that he had been practicing medicine and that he was regarded as a healer by some who were less advanced than the Texas League of Liberty. His patients, while being superstitious and backward, did in fact procure his services to cure illnesses of body and mind, whether or not the Bureau named those services as medical. Throughout these same years, the Bureau was committed in trying to transform the economic system of the South, and a large part of this involved Bureau agents encouraging and writing and supervising and enforcing contracts and rules of payment in the new wage labor economy. Donaldson's plight reveals that they're not intent on all bills being paid. They were hopeful that their lack of action toward Donaldson's claim would put him out of business and shut him up once and for all. So they made no effort to force freed people to pay for these services that they thought should be abandoned, along with other benighted views that pervaded slave culture. One agent wrote of Donaldson, and this is actually maybe my favorite quote in this, I told him, if he was able to conjure diseases out of his patients' bodies, he ought to be able also to conjure his fees out of their pockets without the interference of this Bureau. So I did find more references to Donaldson. He wrote to the Bureau in Washington 7 times through 1866 and 1867, complaining about arrangements for selling cotton, the inefficiency of the post office, intriguingly, the disrespectful behavior of black women toward black men since emancipation, and black women's loose sexual morals and disobedience toward their husbands. And Bureau agents are still complaining about him late in 1867, reporting that he was brought before the mayor of Austin and fined for brutally beating and abusing his wife. And they add that in that account, he continues to labor under the delusion that he is a great doctor and imagines that medical faculty are jealous of him. And I searched through the archives in Washington for after 1867 for more on him, but I never found anything else. But it seemed that I had plenty. The more I thought about the letters by and about Donaldson, the more significance their existence seemed to me. Here's why. Donaldson wrote in the earliest years of emancipation, before the passage of the 14th Amendment, which bestowed citizenship on African Americans. So when he was writing, although he was free, he had very little claim on the federal government, and certainly not enough to berate local agents and refer to his skills at poisoning. It seems to me that for a man who's not legally a citizen and had been a slave only months before all this, Donaldson was striking in his assertions that federal authority must and should take precedence over local government. When Donaldson's dealings with local agents went sour, he always appealed to Washington, D.C. In his mind, one of the government's functions was to force people to pay bills and keep doctors economically afloat. And his hope that the Washington Bureau would aid him in collecting the $35, it does seem naive, but it also demonstrates his apparent feeling of membership and investment in the US government, if not in all the sort of modern ideals that the government would like to foist upon him. And of course, I was so interested in him, I wanted to keep searching. So I did get a little junkie-ish. And since the National Archive trail had gone cold, I went to the local archives in Austin, at the Austin Public Library, where they were just amazing, and the Austin Historical Society. And his public record in Austin is sparse but suggestive. He continued to have friction with white authorities in Austin. He was arrested for disturbing the peace in the spring of 1877, which is very easy to believe, given what we know about his behavior during Reconstruction. It's unclear whether he was able to make a post-war living from medicine. After reading about his trials with the Bureau and the refusal of African American people to pay him, I was pretty sure that he was not able to function as a doctor, and I think that's probably true. But it does get a little more complicated. On the 1880 census, and by 1880, the Freedmen's Bureau had left Austin. So this is a census record from 1880. Donaldson's occupation is listed as laborer. But you can see there's hardly any mistakes on that, right? There's not many cross-outs or whatever. On the whole page, There are only 2 corrections, and they both are in the entry for Donaldson in 1880. Polly Tolbert, who's listed as sharing his dwelling, originally it says wife on the line, but that word is actually crossed out. Who knows how that happened? The census taker may have assumed that Tolbert was Donaldson's wife and then contradicted by Tolbert. Conversely, he may have asked for proof of their marriage and receiving none, crossed out wife. At any rate, it's easy to imagine some kind of back and forth conversation between Donaldson and the census worker, especially in light of the way we've seen Donaldson interact with government employees in the past. But more significant is the second change. If you look carefully, you can see the letters DR are stuck above his name right there. Even though he's listed as a laborer for his occupation, and the DR kind of crowds into the line above there. And given Donaldson's attachment to his identity as a doctor 15 years before this, he may well have insisted on the alteration of the census record. He probably didn't have a lot of choice about the laborer as the designation, but he was able to eke out a small victory with the title of, with that doctor above his name. And I should say that this automatic designation of laborer for African American men on documents persisted well into the 20th century. When I was researching this, I was looking at my own father's birth certificate, and his father was a minister on Sundays, but during the week he was a laborer at the Cotton Exchange in Little Rock, but certainly also had a congregation and had been to a year of college, but it says laborer for my grandfather's occupation. So Donaldson's failure to convince any white authorities of the validity of his herbal medicine crystallized in alternative medicine's fall from respectability in the late 19th and early 20th century. Although herbal medicines and spiritualism would continue to be options available to American consumers, never again would those practitioners be able to claim parity with physicians in terms of state recognition. Even for black doctors who rejected conjuring and herbal medicine, the path to recognition and respect from the dominant medical authorities remained littered with obstacles, a state of affairs recognized by the AMA's apology that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. Donaldson's adult life spanned slavery and freedom. He worked as a doctor before the creation of black medical schools and in the beginning of more intense regulation of the medical profession by authorities. His was the first generation of black Americans to work out adult citizenship in the context of emancipation. Given his chronological provenance, the letters by and about Dr. John Donaldson show a remarkable corner of black experience with freedom and black experience with medicine. His letters and the responses from the bureau agents, as well as from the African Americans in the Texas Loyal League of Liberty, reveal a little explored aspect of medical history and have helped me understand how both race and personality shaped access to education and professional status. In the post-Civil War period, education and professional status did become tightly linked. The professional struggles that Donaldson faced, both as a doctor and a laborer, were hopelessly intertwined with the racial politics of his age and the surprising transformations that arrived with the end of slavery. Thank you.